So, welcome to this follow-up to one of the first Media First webinars that we did. We're joined by Helen again. Helen is from the British Medical Association. And when she joined us on the webinar, which was titled Lessons from Media and Communications Lessons, apologies, from a 12-month-long crisis, at that point, we weren't sure exactly how many questions we were going to get from the audience, but I think we got in the region of about 50. So we didn't manage to get through all of the questions and answers, did we, Helen? So, far from it. So she's very, very generously joined us here again so that we can record some of those questions and just try and answer those off for people. So, Helen, how are you doing? You all right?
Doing well, James. Thanks. Yeah, busy as ever, but it's good to try and answer some questions for people. I'm really happy to do that.
It's very kind of you. Thank you. Right, let's jump into it then. So, Emily Reed, catch-up drinks with journalists seem to be a thing of the past. Sadly, she says in brackets. Any good tips on staying networked with the journalists? What are your thoughts on that, Helen?
I think if you can't meet up for a coffee or a drink, if that really isn't possible because of your schedules or whatever that might be, and obviously with COVID it hasn't been possible, but let's assume that in time it is, then just have a regular catch-up call with them, have a regular phone call, maybe once a week, once a month, depending on how busy you are, and just make sure that you're sending them regular briefings. If you send out a press release, follow it up with a phone call to them, say, just sent this out, just want you to put it under your nose, and even share ideas. So we spend a lot of time just talking to journalists about ideas, kicking ideas around for a potential feature. Sometimes it comes to something, sometimes it doesn't. So it's just keeping them in the loop and having lots of chats with them as much as you can. But I'd still say go for a drink.
It's still taking average. It is that kind of collaborative working approach, though, isn't it? It's about not treating them as a resource. It's about treating them as someone that you want to build that relationship with.
Yeah, it's having a sort of the PR textbooks would call it a symbiotic relationship, and I think that's really important. So that it's give and take on both sides, and just keep it going. It's like kindling a fire; got to keep it kindled.
And in actual fact, Emily, the next webinar, that we're doing is just on this topic. So keep your eyes out for that invitation if you've not already registered. And maybe we'll put some more details on screen for you in a minute. Andrew Duggan, he's got two questions for you. Do you think the enforced remote nature of media activities, I'm going to have to make this bigger, it's a long question. Okay, do you think the enforced remote nature of media activities over the last year, such as video interviews on Zoom, are going to become standard? And do you think they've reshaped the reliance on studio or the need for studios? Do you think we go back to the needing to be in the studios, or do you think we're going to be sticking to Zoom?
I don't think we will stick to Zoom as much as we have. I think it's something that's become more useful, and I think it will perhaps encourage people who can't easily get to a studio to still be interviewed, because it's quite easy to set yourself up and and look relatively professional on a screen. So I think it's something that we will see continue to be used. But I do think that if you have a member of staff or your spokesperson and you can get them into a studio, I would always say do that. I think a studio piece is going to always come across better than sat in your kitchen somewhere.
And I think some people do I think there is an argument to say that some people prefer this means of communicating, though. Is that fair, do you think?
I think so. It's probably a bit less nerve-wracking if you've got a spokesperson that perhaps isn't as au fait with talking to journalists, isn't used to going in and out of TV or radio studios, and to be able to talk from the comfort of their own home. If it makes them feel better, particularly for radio, you don't need to go to a station, then yes, absolutely. If that's going to help you get your message across because your spokesperson is feeling a lot more comfortable in their own home or in their, wherever it might be, their office, then absolutely. But I do think there are times when being present and being there in the studio or in another live situation is definitely always worth it and always has more benefits, I think, than disbenefits.
Linda Feely has asked, how did you manage your spokesperson availability and engagement when they were all working doctors?
That's really tricky because they are, and of course the last thing we would want to do is take them away from front facing and looking after patients, and that was often more difficult for our hospital doctors because Generally, most of our GPs, yes, of course, some of them do out of hours, of course, some do urgent care, but generally most of them, do work during the day. So sometimes getting them in the evenings could be a little bit easier. But with our hospital doctors, if they've been on nights or they're on different shifts, it can be really difficult. What we tried to do was have their shifts and rota patterns. So we looked at when they were available and when they weren't, or when they had a day working for the BMA, and just make sure that we kept in touch with them, ask them to let us know if they'd changed their shift pattern, and just when, and when there were times they were just off limits. So we had a grid basically that said, these doctors are absolutely off grid at this time. These you can call. So that's how we did it.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Good advice. Ginny Wood. It's kind of similar in a sense, I guess. It's about the management of your time and resources. How did you manage, was it even possible to ensure that all internal teams were kept up to speed with the external messages?
That was a challenge. I have to say that's a real challenge. And I think it's something that we worked at very, very hard to do. We didn't always get it right. I think that's fair to say, but we do work as a team. I think the teams in the directorate do work very closely together. And one of the ways we did that was when we talked about what we were going to be saying to the media. So it was a fairly big proactive piece. We would sit and talk with the member relations, with the internal comms teams, and with our web team, who were going to perhaps put some content on the website for members, just to make sure that everybody knew. So we had a funnel system. Something came in through our Stratcoms team, and then we all knew who was going to be saying what and what those key messages were and how they were going to be to go out. And if it was something that we didn't have time to do that, it was a very quick, responsive piece, but again was going to be important. We would alert members via the various channels that we've got to say, look, this is coming. Just you need to be aware of that. So we did try our very best. Occasionally, I think we probably didn't always deliver, but that was how we do it, was by having very joined up thinking from the start.
You say the various channels of communicating. Did you kind of have a priority? If I needed to keep abreast and be up to date, would I go to one particular piece? Would it be via email or WhatsApp or an intranet, or what would it be?
So we have a very strong social media presence. So sometimes we will contact our members via social media, because we do have followers on that. We also have member emails that go out as newsletters. We have all member newsletters. We have breaking news. There's a variety of channels that we would use dependent on what it is. But often if it's something like a really important press release, we would tweet it. We'd use social media and we would tweet it out. If it's something that's got a little bit more planning into it, then we have channels for contacting members through email. They have like an email newsletter, so that we do that as well. Yeah. That's the easiest way.
Do you think, so this is Archana Nair, apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Do you think the pandemic has actually highlighted the value of communications, especially internal communications?
That's hard for me to answer because I'm not an internal communications specialist. I have to say it. I'd hold my hands up to that. I have done internal communications in the past in my career, but for quite a number of years now, I've been involved purely in external. I think for us, it highlighted internal communications in as much as we wanted to make sure all our staff knew where the BMA was going, knew what we were doing, and it was more around making sure all the staff, because obviously we're all remote working, were kept up to speed and felt involved and engaged. So a lot of our internal communications were around making sure staff felt supported, engaged, involved in what the BMA was doing. And then internally, as far as our members were concerned, again, it's going back to those channels that we used before to make sure they fully understood where we were going each day or each week. But I'm not sure I can say specifically because I'm not an internal communications specialist.
Yeah, sure. So a nice easy one from Ruth Supple here. How many people were in your comms team and your crisis team?
Okay, so when we went into the pandemic, I was actually a member of staff down. I was back to recruitment and obviously the pandemic came. So I had 4 members of staff in my team plus myself. We would normally have 5 or 5.5. So we went in with 4, so we were already understaffed. And then we quickly took that up to 7, which is what I now have. And that's a much more manageable number, but that's just for the media team. The department as a whole,
Sure.
the Communications and Policy Directorate, we have about 65 across the whole directorate. But in terms of my department, the media and news relations, there are now 7.
Side question for me then: how able were you to pull on, those other 60 people within the wider comms team?
Very easy, because we do work really well together, and they all, because we're all sort of specialists in our own areas. We've got web, we've got strategic comms, we've got content, we've got internal communications, we've got public affairs and social media. Because we are all used to working very slickly together, we just continue to do that. I think we know how each other works. We know what to do. We've got 5 heads of department, of which I'm one. So again, there's a link there between the heads of department regularly talking to a meeting with the director of communications, and then us talking to our teams as well. So we have a very strong networking system of communications as well. Yeah.
Emily Reid, I feel like we've had a question from Emily before, haven't we? Emily, in what ways did you support the government's comms to ensure consistency, joined up, and accuracy in reporting?
We didn't, because we are an independent organisation, and therefore we would not necessarily support the government communications. Having said that, we wouldn't set out to just deliberately trash them, and we wouldn't set out to undermine them. So particularly around things like the vaccine programme, that's something we recognise absolutely the importance of. And so, as much as the government was saying, please go out and get vaccinated, of course we were saying exactly the same, because we recognise it is really important. But we're not an arm of government in any way, shape or form, and we will call the government to account when we need to do, and did do, and will continue to.
Orla Finnegan, to what extent was the BMA prepared for crisis scenarios in general? Were you able to draw from any crisis scenario planning that you did pre-COVID?
We thought we were. That's the honest answer. So did we have a crisis comms plan? Yes, we did. Have we talked about crisis communications in the past? Because we've experienced it. So perhaps people will remember the junior doctors strike action. That was probably the most recent fairly large crisis that we've had to manage in terms of media communications and member relations and reputation management. But again, that was a crisis of our own doing, if that makes sense. And it was something that we, inadvertently we created, we therefore managed, we therefore had to bring to an end. And I think that was a much more of the usual crisis scenario of beginning, middle and end. Whereas, of course, with this, we had absolutely no idea where it was going to, how long it was going to last. So much of our crisis planning in this instance just absolutely didn't apply. We threw out the rule book and started again.
There's a follow-up question around, do you think you can actually, I'm going to find it actually, because it links really nicely to this. I'm going to paraphrase it for the time being, and I will find out who asked it in a moment. But it was basically, do you think you can actually plan for a crisis? Do you think you can prepare for a crisis in advance? Or is it really a bit of a case of dealing with what you've got in front of you at that moment in time?
I think we can plan now, because I think going through what we've gone through, we have learned so much. And I think there is a number of things you certainly can do to plan for a crisis, however long it's going to last. So I think it's making sure, I think as I said in the webinar, all your processes are in order. So do you know exactly all your contact details of all your journalists, any freelancers that you might need to call upon, your colleagues, other comms teams in organisations that you might want to contact? They're not just kind of scrolled away on your phone somewhere. They're actually in a repository where anybody could access them. So it's things like that. It's just having those real processes clearly and simply put down. If you issue your press releases via something like Gorkana, as we do, again, would somebody coming into the organisation really quickly understand how to do that? Would they understand how to put things onto your website? So a lot of processes, and to make your life easier, I would say make sure all those are really accessible, really easy to find, and anybody can follow them. And in terms of planning beyond that, is just think about how your team is your team big enough? Can they continue? Do they need rest? They can't work 7 days a week for very long, or 15 or 18 hours a day for very long. So if you think it's a crisis that's going to last more than a few days, think about what extra resource you're going to need and where that's going to come from, to give people a break.
And a live question has just come in here, I see, from James White, the Managing Director of Media First, who's questioning whether or not you can prepare your spokespeople in advance of a crisis.
Again, I would say I think up to a point. I think up to a point in the sense that getting them to understand that you perhaps have less time than you would normally have in a more controlled environment, that you're going to be probably a lot more outside your comfort zone than you're used to being, and that some of the questions thrown at you might not be entirely appropriate for your organisation, but in the heat of the moment they may seem to be. So just be able to take those on board. So yes, I do think you can prepare them and train them up to a certain extent. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, I'd agree. That question about can you effectively plan for a crisis was actually from Kirsty McCaskill Baxter. So again, apologies if I've got your name wrong, Kirsty. Emily, she loved the questions, didn't she? Emily Reid again. Emily Reid again. Did you also engage with media? Does she work for you?
No.
Emily Reid, did you also engage in media teams in other countries in the world? Are there any organisations you call out as being exemplary with their approach stroke newsroom?
Gosh, I mean, yes, we dealt with media teams in different parts of the world, but I would say they were more in terms of journalists' newsrooms rather than a team from another organisation. That's not true, because we did actually have some engagement with the Australian Medical Association and with the American Medical Association, because they were very interested in the way we were managing the crisis, particularly the American Medical Association, because they were seeing far bigger issues than we had in many ways, and different political wills, of course, from ours. So they were quite interested in that. And the Australian, in the height of their waves, if you like, we spoke with them as well. So they were more interested in how we were dealing with it and how we were looking at government interaction, and representing the voice of doctors on the front line, and getting that balance right as well. So yes, we did.
Dawn Boyle, how easy was it for you to find spokespeople amongst working doctors who must have had to prioritise treating patients during the pandemic? I think we've answered that one, haven't we, Helen? But Dawn, thank you very much for your question. Charles Abel, full disclosure, Charles is actually one of our media trainers. How did you achieve consistent messaging across the whole media team, all of your spokespeople and the whole of the BMA team? Did any software tools help?
I think one of the ways we achieved it was all the spokespeople all our BMA spokespeople are media trained, for a start off. So that's the first thing, is that they are all being put through at least 1 day's worth of media training, so they understand the mechanics, they understand the pitfalls, they understand the art of answering, bridging, communicating, they understand the art of the pause, the art of silence. So all those skills, they've all been trained in that. And in terms of consistent messaging, we always ensure any of our spokespeople get a complete briefing before they do any interview. So they know exactly what our key messages are for the day, and if it's a particular interview, what we'd like them to say for that interview as well. And we'll give them key lines to take, and we'll give them a bit of background. Each evening we produced a COVID briefing. We still do to this day. And that COVID briefing is what are the top lines of the day from the government press conference, and also the key lines from the BMA into the following morning for any interviews. So they've got that as well each evening. So that's how we made sure that the messaging was consistent when we went out to do interviews.
Would you do, again, follow-up question from me, but would you do follow-up reviews of the people of your spokespeople's interviews? So I appreciate a lot went into the briefing, but did you do reviews afterwards?
We do. We do watch them, particularly the key ones. So the key ones for the Today programme, the main Sky News, BBC News. We will watch them closely. The Sophie Ridge, Andrew Marr. Those kind of what I'd call the set piece programmes. We will watch them closely, and then we'll sit down with them afterwards and go through their answers. And we'll also go through how they deliver it. So as much as what they say, how did they come across? How did they deliver it? What was the impression that they gave by their body language and the way they spoke? And generally, it's about being supportive. We don't sit about putting them to pieces because we want them to do it again. We generally, quite consistent and quite supportive. And we also did, when we first all took to Zoom or Teams or whatever it was, we also sent out a package, if you like, of how to make your Zoom call look as good as it can be. So what do you need to look like? How do you need to position yourself? How do you need to come across via a small computer screen? So we did that as well, because there was a couple of times with some very interesting things behind people which we didn't think was entirely appropriate. So yeah, they were asked to remove.
Do tell. What interesting things, Helen?
Well, of course, our spokespeople are doctors, and many of them would talk from their studies. So sometimes it could be something
Okay.
that potentially might be patient identifiable. It wasn't, but I mean that was one thing we were worried about. It might be case notes or files, but it wasn't. It was more sort of anatomical things that have a perfectly good medical use, but perhaps on the camera over somebody's left shoulder doesn't quite cut the same sort of picture. So we just asked them to be really careful what was on display.
Had to be careful of the optics
Yes.
of the thing. Jamie McDonald. How did you manage differing options inside the How did you manage differing opinions inside the organisation on communications approach and what was being said? I've lost the ability to be able to speak, but hopefully you understood that.
Again, it's a challenge. I suppose it comes down to the fact that we try and use our professionalism, our skill. So if we as a media team are recommending a particular train of thought or a particular set of actions or a particular type of answer or the way we're going to approach something, and we have a difference of opinion from one of our chief officers or our chair of council, who are our most senior team, we'll sit down with them and talk it through. And if at the end of the day their view is no, we still want you to do it like this, then of course that's their view. We respect that. We'll talk them through the potential pitfalls if we think there is something. But generally we try and find a mutually agreed way of working. But more often than not, we are relied upon, I would say, for our professionalism and our expertise to deliver the goods. But again, that comes from trust and from respect and from having a really good working relationship with those senior people in your organisation, so they feel comfortable to let you take the steps you think are necessary to take.
Sarah Chubb, how did you manage communications with internal employees and keep them up to date with what the BMA was saying externally, with the timings very short and demanding, and did you make significant changes? I think you've probably answered a few of that, but is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think the other thing was, I guess we had weekly departmental meetings. So every week, the entire department, entire directorate would have a Zoom call. So at least once a week, everybody in the directorate was invited to a 45-minute, hour-long call. And then each Monday, we have what's called the huddle, which is when we share within the directorate key things that are going on that week. And then once a month, the chief executive and senior managers, senior leaders and directors will hold an all-staff meeting. So it's done at a number of levels with varying regularity to try and keep people up to date and informed as well.
I keep getting distracted by another one here. You look fantastic. I would have gone with grey with that much pressure. You were wearing white, weren't you, on the day of the webinar?
Exactly. Stone colour, I think it was. Yeah, stone.
Was it? Did the BMA take on any PR freelancers to support? In what ways did you improve the newsroom to signpost journalists to the best bit of info and visuals?
So take that in two parts. Yes, we did. In the early days, we did bring in a PR agency to help us in two ways. One was to help my team just, help triage the calls that came in, literally the bums on seats idea, and to keep across the calls and help us draft some of the basic responses and press releases. So we did that. We also brought them in to give us a little bit of a strategic overview, looking ahead, how was the BMA going to navigate its way and its position through this? How did we sort of retain and in fact build on our agency and our authenticity? Because clearly this was a time for the BMA to shine like no other, if you effectively to have that that integrity and that authority. So that was another way that we asked them for some help. So we had the PR agency for about 2 months, I think, between about April and June, something like that, in 2020. So we did do that. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry, James.
I knew you were going to ask me that. In what ways did you improve the newsroom, signpost journalists to the best info and visuals?
So a lot of our visuals were on social media, on Twitter, which we used, and so that's where most of our graphs and our infographics and things like that will be placed. And again, the website. If we issued a press release, we'd always put links on the press release as to where they could find any additional data if they needed it, which we use. And we use a software called Flourish, which is really helpful to us to make some of that data come alive. And in terms of signposting them, I guess that would come down to when we issue a press release or when we put out a briefing, picking up the phone and saying to them, this has just gone out, we think this will be really interesting to you. Or if it was an exclusive, we'd have those conversations early in the week to establish what that exclusive was going to be like. What did they want from us? What could we deliver to make sure the end package was, was suitable for both parties?
Very good. What does Flourish do?
I shouldn't be saying this. I'm probably going to give a big sales pitch now. It's a way of visualizing data, so it can make graphs interactive, and you can overlay different aspects, so you can interrogate it and look at different responses. So if you put one set of data in, this happens. If you put another set of data in, that happens. Or you can overlay different years of data. We use it for imagery, so you can almost have like a before and an after picture. So if you take two photographs of exactly the same thing, for instance, you overlay one against the other, and as you take the slider across, one overlays the other and shows the changes that have happened over a period of time.
What's the Ruth Supple? What's the biggest learning for you during the ongoing crisis?
I should have asked for a pay rise. No, that's not it. No, that's not it at all. The biggest learning curve is to not underestimate the impact on your mental health, your mental well-being, because we spoke so much about, quite rightly, the impact on our doctors and our nurses. In fact, all health and social care staff. I'm not just singling out doctors, and the work they have done is beyond incredible. But I think not to underestimate the impact, both in terms of the work, the sheer level of work that you're doing, and how that impacts on you, and also what you're dealing with. It is quite traumatic. It is quite harrowing, looking at the death toll creeping every day. So I think if your crisis involves something particularly harrowing, is don't underestimate and find that help and support you will need and your team will need as well.
David Stevenson, how have you managed the transition back from peak crisis period back to some form of business as usual? And how is business as usual now working for your team whilst people are working remotely?
I don't think we've gone back to business as usual, to be honest. Yes, we're not in the peak of the crisis that we were in last year at this time, or after Christmas. So that's true, but we are still incredibly busy, and I'd say we haven't gone back to anything what I would call pre-March 2020. So at the moment we're in that rather interesting phase of we've still got quite a lot of COVID-related work, but what you quite rightly say is business as usual is now beginning to come back in and into the play as well. So we're just understanding how to transition between the two. I think one of the things we're doing is perhaps some of the COVID inquiries that we now get that we don't feel we need to be a part of anymore, or we don't feel delivers anything for the BMA, we will reject. So maybe some interviews we might have done, or some requests for interviews, or some requests for comments we would have done a few months ago. We've decided now not to do, because we've either said it before, or we don't think there's any agency in it for the BMA to do.
The rest of the questions here, I mean, they're really just compliments for you, Helen. And you were and remain a fantastic guest and speaker. So thank you very, very much. It's really been a pleasure having you part of this webinar series, and I genuinely am grateful for you, and also for taking the time to follow up with these questions as well. One of the questions that we did have here was, will they be able to get a recording of the webinar? And obviously we have now sent that out, and we'll be sending this bunch of questions out as well. So Helen, thank you again.
My pleasure, James.
And yeah, very kind.
Thank you so much. Thank you.